Some nights seemed stitched together from moonlight and memory, and this was one of them. A hush settled over the sleeping town, as if even the cobblestones were holding their breath. Out beyond the square where lanterns swayed like low stars, an old garden waited behind a crooked iron gate. Its paths were lined with broken sundials and wind-worn statues, and in the heart of it, nestled among ivy and wild rosemary, a child lay curled in the cool grass. No one knew from where he had wandered, nor why his small hands gave off the faintest silver glow, like the reflection of a faraway lake. Tonight, while the world turned softly overhead, the story bent itself toward him, and you, dear listener, are welcome to lean closer. We truly care about you, and we're grateful that you're here. Before we wander further, tell us quietly to yourself, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it there? Now, let's begin. The garden belonged to a clockmaker who had once been known across valleys for the gentle steadiness of his work. Age had slowed him, but the rhythm of his life still moved with patient gears. He found the boy just after dawn, when mist was lifting from the roses and the scent of rain lingered in the hedges. Kneeling beside him, the clockmaker noticed that the silver shimmer on the child's palms pulsed faintly, like breathing light. The boy stirred at the touch of a warm hand and opened eyes, the color of quiet water. He said nothing. His gaze held a listening quality, as though he were already hearing something hidden in the day. The clockmaker carried him inside, wrapping him in a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar. The cottage was small, but filled with steady sounds, the slow tick of clocks, the faint hiss of a kettle, the soft exhale of wind through narrow windows. The child studied every corner, wide-eyed yet unafraid, as if this place had been waiting for him all along. When offered bread with honey, he ate carefully as though tasting each crumb's history. The man watched in silence, feeling a quiet cord tug inside his chest, one he hadn't felt since his wife had passed some winters ago. No name accompanied the boy, so the clockmaker gave him one, Ilian, chosen for its lilt of open sky. The syllables seemed to fit, light but steady, and the boy smiled faintly when he heard it, as if something about the sound settled him. Days stretched in an unhurried rhythm. Ilian followed the clockmaker around the garden, learning the names of herbs and the way dew beads slide from leaf to leaf at sunrise. Sometimes he would pause, hands resting lightly on stone or soil, eyes far away, as though listening to something the older man could not hear. He never forced words, but when he did speak, his voice held a softness like a page turning in an old book. In the evenings, when lanterns blinked awake along the fence, the clockmaker would tell stories about the village, how the baker left a lantern lit so travelers could find their way, or how the miller's cat could sense approaching rain. Ilian listened with unwavering calm, absorbing each tale as if it were a thread to be woven into a larger tapestry. Sometimes, while the old man spoke, a tender radiance would appear at the edges of Ilian's hands, glowing faintly in the dusk. It was never bright enough to alarm, just enough to suggest that something within him belonged to another rhythm, one softer than the ordinary hum of life. Weeks passed. The townsfolk, noticing a child by the clockmaker's side, would smile politely, though some whispered about the light they swore they'd seen. Ilian never minded their curiosity. He seemed to understand that people often speak to soothe their own puzzlement. He helped sweep fallen petals, carried tools, and learned to wind clocks so they sang gently at the hour. More than anything, he learned to wait for the kettle's sigh, for shadows to settle, for the moment when time itself felt content to sit down beside them. One late afternoon, after a rainstorm, Ilian wandered alone among the wet branches. The garden smelled of moss and new beginnings. He crouched to watch droplets gather on a blade of grass, trembling before they fell. In that quiet, he felt the pulse in his hands echo the rain's rhythm, as if the world were speaking through tiny syllables of water. A low breeze carried the scent of pine and old stone, and for a heartbeat he thought he could almost hear words within it. Not clear language, more like a melody meant to be understood only by stillness. He stayed there until the clockmaker called him in for supper, reluctant to break the fragile music. That night, tucked under a quilt patched with moons and rivers, Ilian drifted towards sleep. The house settled around him with a sigh and the gentle ticking of dozens of clocks stitched through his dreams. He felt safe in a way he could not name, wrapped in the quiet care of someone who had chosen to see him not as a question, but as a beginning. Outside, the lanterns gleamed faintly against the velvet dark, like promises waiting to be kept. Somewhere beyond the hedges, an unseen wind carried hints of stories still to come, and Ilian's fingers glowed just slightly, as if catching light from tomorrow's dawn. Ilian liked to wander to the edge of the garden, where a slender bridge crossed a stream so calm it almost looked asleep. Beyond it, fields stretched toward soft hills, and in spring the air carried a scent of violets and distant rain. One afternoon, as mist curled above the water, he saw a girl crouched near the far bank, tracing shapes in the reflection. Her hair fell across her cheek like a stray brushstroke. She was drawing clouds on the surface with the tip of a reed, trying to capture how the sky felt, not how it looked. Ilian watched quietly until she lifted her head, eyes bright as morning. She smiled, shy but steady, and invited him closer without a word. Her name was Lyra, and she lived near the mill at the edge of town. She spoke in a voice that felt like warm bread and wind through leaves. Ilian, unused to company his own age, hesitated, then settled beside her. Together they watched the way the stream collected pieces of Lyra explained she liked to draw what water remembered, hints of shapes that slipped past unnoticed. Ilian didn't always follow her meaning, but he understood the warmth behind her words. For a long time, they sat with their feet dangling above ripples, sharing crumbs of honey bread and quiet laughter. As days unfolded, their meetings became a quiet ritual. Sometimes they built little rafts from twigs and petals, setting them adrift like tiny travelers. Other times they leaned back on the grass, letting stories rise slowly between them, memories of birdsong, or how lantern light looked when rain polished the streets. Lyra had a way of noticing things Ilian had felt but never named, and he found himself talking more than he ever had. She listened with a stillness that made even unfinished thoughts feel complete. The clockmaker, pleased to see Ilian's steps lightened by friendship, packed them small lunches and told them not to hurry home. He knew the bridge was teaching the boy something steady, how companionship can be as gentle as a tide. On a late summer evening, while dragonflies hummed low, Ilian showed Lyra how his palms sometimes glowed when the air grew still. She touched the light softly as if afraid it might scatter, and whispered that it reminded her of the stars' reflections at midnight. Her acceptance folded the secret safely between them. One dusk, a storm brewed far off, sending tremors through the reeds. Lyra and Ilian sheltered beneath the bridge, listening to raindrops drum above their heads. In that tiny haven, time thinned until there was only their breath and the scent of wet earth. When the clouds cleared, a pale moon spread across the stream, silvering everything in sight. They didn't speak, they simply watched as water mirrored sky, and for the first time Ilian felt that belonging was not something you earned. It was something you allowed. Autumn tiptoed into the valley, dusting the garden with gold. Leaves spun lazily to the ground, and lanterns glowed earlier in the evening, their halos soft against the dimming air. One night, as the clockmaker mended a gear by candlelight, a faint rustle passed along the window ledge. Ilian peered out and caught sight of a folded scrap resting against the glass. It smelled faintly of pine and rain, though the sky had been clear for days. The note held only a few words: "Listen, and you'll know." No name, no signature, only the feeling of something benevolent standing just beyond sight. More notes followed over the next weeks, each appearing in quiet corners, atop a garden wall, inside the curve of a watering can, between pages of an old almanac. They were always written in a steady hand, brief but warm, speaking of patience, of watching the small places where wonder waits. At first, Ilian thought perhaps the clockmaker had left them, but the man only shook his head and smiled. Whoever sent them seemed to know the rhythm of the boy's thoughts, as though guiding him toward a gift he had yet to understand. One twilight, Ilian discovered a new note tucked beneath the bridge where he met Lyra. It read, "The world hums quietly. Trust the hush." He held it carefully, feeling its weight despite its lightness. Lyra traced the words with her fingertip, agreeing they felt like a riddle meant to be solved by waiting rather than searching. They spent that evening speaking in low voices, letting the river carry their laughter downstream. When they parted, Ilian slipped the message into his pocket, close to where his hands still hummed with faint light. As autumn deepened, the air grew sharp and fragrant with wood smoke. Ilian felt the notes weaving through his days, gentle as threads through cloth. They reminded him to slow down, to notice how morning frost stitched lace along the windows, how the clockmaker's stories curved like commas through time. Sometimes he would pause mid-task, certain he could hear something beyond the ticking and rustling, a soft pulse woven into the air itself. The sensation made him neither afraid nor eager. It was simply there, as natural as breath. One evening, while lanterns flickered against a clear sky, another message appeared on the stone bench beneath the orchard tree. "Kindness is an echo," it said. Ilian read it aloud to the clockmaker, whose eyes softened in the candle's glow. "Perhaps," the old man murmured, "someone knows you're learning to hear what most forget." He didn't explain further, but his hand lingered on Ilian's shoulder, steady as an anchor. Later that night, Ilian lay awake beneath a patchwork quilt, holding the slip of paper like a promise. Beyond the window, the garden breathed quietly, and in the distance, a lone owl stitched its call into the silence. The boy felt the calm of belonging settle around him once more, as though the universe itself had leaned close to whisper goodnight. Morning light spilled through thin curtains, casting quiet stripes across the cottage floor. Ilian woke to the steady rhythm of the clocks, their ticks blending like a low lullaby. He rose slowly, letting the hush of the room settle into his bones. That day, the clockmaker invited him to the workbench, where gears and tiny screws lay in neat, patient rows. "Clocks," the old man said, "teach us how to listen, not only to minutes but to the pauses in between." Ilian leaned closer, fascinated by how each piece waited for its partner, how a single turn of a wheel could invite the whole mechanism to breathe again. As weeks passed, Ilian's palms began to shimmer more often, faint and silver, especially when the world around him was still. He started to hear something gentle hidden within ordinary sounds, a sigh behind the tick of a clock, a melody tangled in the rustle of leaves, a kindness stitched into rain against the window. Sometimes, while polishing brass or brushing dust from an old pendulum, he would wadge mid-motion, eyes far away, feeling the air, speak in whispers too soft for words. The clockmaker watched without question, knowing some lessons bloom best in silence. One misty afternoon, Ilian sat on the cottage step with a cup of tea warming his hands. He closed his eyes, letting the breeze carry scents of rosemary and wood smoke. In that quiet, the hum inside him aligned with the world beyond. He felt the stream's unhurried flow, the drowsy weight of clouds, even the hidden roots stretching through soil. It was as if the land itself trusted him enough to reveal its smallest voice. When he opened his eyes, everything seemed edged with a soft clarity: lanterns, fence posts, the gentle slouch of an old scarecrow in the field. He began sharing these perceptions with Lyra when they met by the bridge. She listened, head tilted, sometimes smiling at the strangeness of it, sometimes simply resting her hand over his as if to steady the unspoken. Together they practiced stillness, watching ripples form patterns neither could fully explain. Evenings often ended with quiet laughter or stories traded as twilight slipped into the stream. The glow from Ilian's hands would sometimes light the pages of her sketches, and she would draw the shimmer as if it were another element of nature, like moonlight or rain. On nights when sleep was slow to come, Ilian lay awake, considering the notes that had appeared through the autumn. Their words nudged him gently toward trust, in listening, in slowness, in the way kindness leaves traces. He wondered about the unseen hand that left them, but the wonder never pressed into worry. It felt more like being guided by a calm current. The boy understood, without needing to name it, that the quiet itself was part of his gift, and that learning to hear meant also learning to wait. Wrapped in this thought, he often drifted into peaceful dreams, the lanterns outside blinking like friendly constellations. Winter began as a whisper, dusting frost across windows and turning puddles to glass before sunrise. The garden slowed, its herbs resting under silvered soil, while lanterns flickered earlier against the dark. Ilian and Lyra still met by the bridge, their breaths curling like small clouds in the crisp air. They spoke less in these months, content to watch the river move beneath thin ice, to listen as branches creaked in soft protest against the cold. Sometimes Ilian would slip a pebble across the frozen surface, marveling at how sound rang out like a bell through the stillness. One afternoon, Lyra arrived with a folded cloth in her mittened hands. Inside was a lantern, smaller than the ones lining the fence, painted with scenes of sky and drifting birds. "For you," she said, cheeks flushed from wind. "So you'll remember the bridge even on nights when snow hides it." Ilian accepted the gift carefully, touched by its quiet thoughtfulness. He promised to keep it near his bedside, a reminder of all the listening they had done together. They spent that evening sketching frost patterns along the railing, laughing softly when their drawings vanished beneath a gust of snow. Soon after, Lyra told him her family would be leaving the valley before the thaw. The news settled like gentle rain, unavoidable yet kind in its honesty. Ilian felt a heaviness he couldn't quite name, as if part of the calm he had learned was preparing to travel far away. They walked along the stream, letting silence say what words could not. Lyra pressed her palm against his, covering the faint light there, and promised she would return. "Look for the lantern," she whispered. "Even if you don't see me, it will hold a piece of now." In the days that followed, Ilian tried to focus on helping the clockmaker mend stubborn timepieces and sweep snow from the path, but his thoughts often drifted toward the bridge. He visited alone, standing where footprints once mingled, gazing at the pale reflection of the sky in frozen water. When the wind rose, he imagined it carrying fragments of laughter or the soft scrape of a reed across paper. The notes that once appeared around the cottage seemed to pause, as though even they were waiting for this chapter of his story to settle. On Lyra's final morning, pale sunlight brushed the hills with gold. They met beneath the bridge one last time, exchanging no more than a few words. She placed a small sketch inside his coat pocket, a drawing of lanterns floating above a stream. Then she walked away with her family, turning only once to wave. Ilian stood very still, holding the picture as snowflakes blurred the world around him. That night, he set her lantern by his window, its glow steady against the dark. He felt sadness, yes, but also a quiet gratitude for having shared a season of listening with someone who understood. Wrapped in that mix of loss and warmth, he watched the light until sleep came softly. Spring returned slowly, as if testing the world before committing to bloom. The snow melted in rivulets, and the garden's herbs peeped timidly from the softened earth. Ilian, now older and steadier in his movements, noticed that the silver in his palms pulsed more confidently, though still quietly, like hidden sunlight under clouds. He spent mornings winding clocks and afternoons walking along the riverbank, listening to how each ripple carried memory of rain, of frost, of voices long gone. Even in solitude, the air seemed to hum with a gentle kind of conversation, and he felt grateful simply to be part of it. The clockmaker, slower with age yet sharp of mind, encouraged him to help neighbors who needed small kindnesses, mending a child's toy, delivering bread to the widow down the lane, or repairing a gate before a storm. Each act, Elian realized, resonated with the pulse he had learned to hear. Helping became a meditation. It was not about recognition, but about noticing where his presence mattered, where a moment of quiet attention could calm a restless heart. Sometimes, after completing a task, he would pause and feel the silver glow in his hands fade, leaving a warmth that spread inward rather than outward. Occasionally the notes reappeared, tucked in places that seemed impossible, inside a worn book in the library, along the window ledge of the bakery, even woven into a ribbon at the mill. Each offered encouragement and gentle guidance. Notice what bends without breaking. Kindness is the quietest echo. Elian began to understand that listening was more than hearing. It was being present, allowing the world to speak without judgment. These whispers, these small currents of advice, became the scaffolding of his days. By summer, the garden was lush and fragrant. Elian often sat near the bridge, hands resting lightly on its railing, watching the river bend and shimmer. He remembered Lyra and the lantern she had given him, and although her visits had grown rare, the memory of their shared stillness remained vivid. He thought about the unspoken language they had developed, the way silence could carry meaning heavier than words. And in these moments he noticed the rhythm inside himself, steady, patient, echoing with quiet joy, like a clock whose mechanism is invisible but perfectly aligned. One evening, as twilight settled, he heard soft footsteps approaching. At first he thought it was the wind, brushing against the reeds. But then a familiar laugh, small and airy, cut through the hush. Lyra had returned, carrying tales of distant hills and rivers. Their reunion was gentle, the kind that needed no grand announcement, no fanfare. They walked together along the water, exchanging stories and silences alike. And for the first time, Elian felt the pull of shared experiences shaping him from the inside out. The pulse in his hands seemed to hum in harmony with the world, and he understood that growth could be quiet, almost imperceptible, yet profound. Summer ripened fully, golden and soft, and the garden shimmered with every shade of green. Elian and Lyra spent their days moving slowly through its paths, listening to leaves, clouds, and the murmur of hidden streams. Lyra spoke of her travels, of distant villages where lanterns lit empty streets at dusk, and Elian shared his quiet discoveries. How light could rest on the smallest details, how kindness was woven into the rhythm of life. Their conversations, gentle and meandering, felt like a continuation of all the quiet lessons the garden had taught him. One afternoon, while sitting beneath an old oak, Lyra unfolded a folded map. On it were sketches of rivers, bridges, and small towns with lantern symbols marking places she had been. "I've been thinking," she said softly, tracing a finger along one line. "Maybe there are others like you who listen the way you do." Elian felt warmth rise within him, a mingling of curiosity and certainty. He understood that the silver glow in his hands, the quiet pulse he had learned to follow, was part of a larger thread, one that reached beyond the garden, beyond even the river's bend. They continued their days in gentle companionship, watching lanterns float on water during evening festivals and tracing patterns in the clouds while lying in the grass. Elian noticed how much he had grown, not in height or strength, but in patience, understanding, and the capacity to hold both joy and melancholy together. Lyra often caught him watching moments others overlooked, a bird settling on a fence post, a child's hesitant laughter, the way shadows stretched and softened in fading light, and she would smile, recognizing the same reverence in him that she had always known. As the season waned, the two shared more stories of past absences and small losses, each conversation strengthening their bond. Elian realized that relationships, like gardens, required care and attention, and that love could be quiet and steady, nourished by shared stillness and understanding. One evening, beneath the glow of lanterns floating on the river, Lyra rested her hand against his, and they allowed themselves the comfort of silence. There was no urgency, no need for words. The river's song and the lantern's shimmer spoke in a language older than speech. By late summer, Ilion understood that life's quiet heroism was not about grand gestures, but about the depth of attention one gave to the world and the people within it. The glow in his hands, once a mystery, now felt like a reflection of what he had learned, that presence, patience, and gentle listening could change the course of days, and perhaps of lives. And as night fell, he sat beside Lyra, letting the river carry their laughter and whispers into the dark, knowing that some bonds, once formed, never truly fade. The village prepared for the slow festival, a celebration unlike any other, where lanterns drifted gently across the river, reflecting in the water like scattered stars. Ilion moved through the streets carrying a small lantern of his own, its light mingling with hundreds of others. He noticed the elderly baker arranging his pastries with quiet care, the children laughing as they chased the flickering glow, and the miller setting his lanterns along the fence so travelers could find their way home. Every detail seemed alive, every gesture a kind of music, and Ilion felt the pulse within his hands thrum in harmony with it all. As evening fell, the lanterns were released, rising slowly into the dusky sky. People stood in small clusters, their voices hushed in reverent awe, watching the lights drift together in an unspoken dance. Lyra joined him by the riverbank, holding his hand gently as they observed the spectacle. He felt the glow of the lanterns echoing in his palms, like a distant, tender heartbeat. Together, they traced the path of each floating light, imagining the hopes and memories carried within. It was not the brilliance of the lanterns themselves that moved him, but the quiet attention each person had given to their placement, their care, their intent. In the days leading to the festival, Ilion had helped neighbors with preparations, offering hands and patience wherever needed. The work had been simple, tying ribbons, hanging lanterns, checking ropes, yet each act held weight, a recognition that small attentions ripple outward. As he watched the village settle into the festival's rhythm, he understood something he hadn't before. The world's beauty often comes not from grand gestures, but from countless small, mindful choices, gently folded into daily life. He breathed in the scent of candles, fresh bread, and autumn air, letting it mingle with the quiet song in his heart. When the final lantern floated out of sight, Ilion lingered by the river, his reflection mingling with the dim stars. Lyra pressed a finger to his wrist, feeling the pulse there, a soft reminder of all they had discovered together. "It is enough," she whispered, as if sharing a secret with the night. He nodded, understanding that the gift he had been given, the ability to notice, to attend, to hold presence, had finally found its stage. No words could fully capture it, no motion could define it, only stillness could honor its truth. That night, he returned home, carrying the memory of lanterns, whispers, and river song into dreams that shimmered long after sleep arrived. Winter settled again, soft and deliberate, blanketing the garden in frost and silence. Ilion spent mornings among clocks and afternoons in the attic, discovering stacks of letters he had never noticed before. They were carefully bound, each envelope bearing faint symbols of a hand familiar yet unseen. As he opened one, the paper released a faint scent of pine and rain. The handwriting was precise, calm, encouraging. "You have listened well," it read. "The world speaks in moments. Learn to hold them gently." He felt a warmth in his chest, a recognition that these messages were not just for instruction, but for companionship, a steady presence guiding him across the quiet edges of life. The letters led him to stories of those who had come before, people who had practiced the gentle art of listening, passing wisdom quietly from hand to hand. They spoke of children, soothed by small gestures, of odor eased by patience, of friendships nurtured in silence. Ilian began leaving replies in small folded notes of his own, tucked in attics, gardens, and library shelves, not knowing if anyone would ever read them. Sometimes the wind carried them to the right place, sometimes not, but the act itself became a meditation, an extension of the gift he had been learning to cherish. In the evenings he would light a candle and read the letters by its flickering glow. He traced each word with his finger, savoring the cadence and the thoughtfulness behind every line. The clockmaker, older now, often sat beside him in quiet agreement, the silence between them rich with understanding. Ilian realized that the letters were less about instruction and more about connection, a reminder that the world contained unseen threads, invisible but strong, binding people together through attention, care, and presence. As winter deepened, Ilian felt a sense of continuity, of standing on the shoulders of those who had moved gently through life before him. The gift of listening had become inseparable from his own pulse, the quiet silver glow in his hands no longer a mystery but a reflection of the inner rhythm he had cultivated. By candlelight he folded a fresh note and tucked it in the attic, imagining it reaching someone who might need it one day. Outside, the garden slept under frost. The lanterns dimmed, and the air carried a stillness that was complete, enough to fill every corner of his being with the patient music of the world. Snow had receded, leaving the orchard bare but patient, its branches etched against a pale sky. Ilian spent mornings moving slowly among the trees, noticing how each twig held the memory of seasons past. One branch bore a small knot, like a heartbeat caught in wood, and he paused there, pressing his palm gently to feel its story. The clockmaker, now more fragile with time, watched him from the porch, his hands folded as if holding invisible threads. "The quiet work of observation," he murmured, "is the most enduring kind." Ilian nodded, feeling the truth in the words settle deep into him. As days passed, the clockmaker fell ill, and Ilian took to sitting at his side, attending to him with soft attentions, brushing crumbs from his coat, warming tea, adjusting blankets. There were moments when the old man's breathing faltered, leaving silence thick and tender around them. Ilian rested his hand lightly on the man's wrist, letting the pulse in his own hands merge with the slow rhythm of care. He read aloud from letters tucked in drawers, stories of unseen kindnesses and quiet heroes, letting the words carry warmth into the room. Even in sickness, the clockmaker seemed buoyed by the gentleness surrounding him, each gesture a small act of love that needed no announcement. Outside, the orchard whispered in spring wind, buds stirring as if to keep watch over the house. Ilian noticed how the world persisted in beauty. Even as seasons of loss came to claim their share, he learned that patience and presence were the truest comforts, more than medicine, more than words, and that the act of simply being with someone could ease the heaviest of shadows. Nights passed with lanterns glimmering faintly against frost-silvered branches, and in dreams he felt the pulse of the orchard, steady, enduring, reminding him of continuity beyond time. When the clockmaker finally closed his eyes for the last time, Ilian stayed by the bedside, holding his hand until it grew still. There was sadness, yes, but also a quiet reverence, the kind that comes from understanding the natural rhythm of life and letting it flow without resistance. Outside, the orchard held its breath, as if acknowledging the passing, and Ilian felt a deep gratitude for having been entrusted with care, for having learned that true heroism is a soft, unwavering attention to others. That night, he walked among the bare trees, lantern in hand, feeling the pulse of the world continue beneath frost and sky. Years passed gently, each day blending into the next like water in a slow river. Ilian found himself drawn to the same bridge where he had met Lyra so many seasons ago, and there he met a child whose curiosity mirrored his own when he was small. The boy or girl watched the river with wide eyes, tracing ripples with a stick, noticing shadows in a way that suggested they could hear the unspoken world. Ilian knelt beside them, offering a lantern that glimmered softly, as if carrying the warmth of countless mornings, afternoons, and quiet nights. He began to teach the child not through instructions but by example, how to pause, how to breathe, how to listen to the murmurs of wind and water, and the hidden rhythms in everyday life. Together they moved through the garden and orchard, tending seedlings, winding clocks, observing clouds and stars alike. Elian showed how attention could turn the ordinary into something profound, how the smallest acts of kindness resonated far beyond the moment. The child listened with rapt patience, sometimes asking questions, sometimes simply resting in silence, and each encounter felt like a passing of a torch. The glow in Elian's hands pulsed faintly whenever he shared these moments, not as a display but as a reflection of the connection unfolding quietly around him. In the evenings, they would sit beneath the lanterns, watching light spill across the water, and Elian would tell stories of his own childhood, of Lyra, of the clockmaker, and of notes that appeared from unseen hands. The child's laughter and gentle wonder reminded him that life always had room for new stories, and that lessons of care and presence were never fully finished, only carried forward. He understood now that legacy was not measured in monuments or fame, but in these small, patient gestures that ripple endlessly through time. One late afternoon, as shadows lengthened and the sky blushed with gold, Elian released the child's hand, letting them watch the river together. Still and unhurried, he felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of completion that was soft, not sharp. The understanding that life's most important work is gentle, enduring, and passed along through quiet attention. And as the sun dipped behind distant hills, lanterns swaying in the evening breeze, Elian felt himself part of an unbroken chain of care, listening, and love, ready to let the world continue its soft, steady unfolding. Autumn arrived with a slow sigh, brushing the orchard in shades of amber and honey. Elian walked the familiar paths, hands folded behind his back, feeling the pulse of the world beneath his feet. Years had softened him in ways no one could measure, not in stature, but in patience, in the ability to notice what most overlooked. Lanterns flickered along the fences, echoes of festivals past, guiding his steps toward the bridge where he had met Lyra so many seasons ago. The river murmured beneath the ice-free surface, carrying stories of time, of laughter, of quiet loss and love. He paused, listening not only with ears but with the weight of every year he had gathered, every lesson of stillness and care. When he reached the bridge, Lyra was already there, waiting as if no time had passed at all. Her hair, streaked with silver, caught the late sun, and her eyes reflected the calm of a shared past. They greeted one another without ceremony, simply falling into the quiet ease of companionship that had grown over decades. Together they traced the river's winding path with their gazes, sharing memories that needed no words. The glow of lanterns, the first flicker of silver in his hands, the notes left by an unseen hand, and the small gestures of kindness that had rippled across their lives. Every moment felt both fragile and eternal, as if the universe itself paused to witness their reunion. They sat in silence for long stretches, listening to the wind and watching leaves drift into the water, tracing slow circles before disappearing. Elian felt a deep gratitude for Lyra, for the clockmaker, for the child he had guided, and for the countless quiet presences that had shaped his days. He realized that life's meaning often arrives not in dramatic gestures, but in the patient tending of hearts, in the steady pulse of attention, in the soft echo of kindness passed along. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel complete, held not by circumstance but by the woven threads of connection and care. As twilight deepened, they released small lanterns onto the river, watching them drift slowly downstream. The lights bobbed and shimmered, carrying memories, hopes, and whispers of gratitude. Elian's hands glowed faintly, a reflection of the inner harmony he had cultivated over a lifetime, and he let himself breathe in the quiet beauty of the world. Lyra rested her hand lightly on his, and together they felt the rhythm of time itself, soft and enduring, like a heartbeat shared across decades. The orchard sighed, the river sang, and the lanterns twinkled like distant stars, reminding him that even as life moves forward, certain moments of love, understanding, and presence remain luminous, unbroken, and eternal. Night fell gently over the valley, stretching shadows across the orchard and river. Ilian and Lyra lingered on the bridge, watching lanterns drift far downstream, their soft glow mirrored in the water below. The world had grown quiet around them, as if granting permission for reflection, for memory to unfurl without hurry. He thought of the clockmaker, of letters left in attics, of the child he had taught to listen, all pieces of a story that had stretched across years like a delicate thread. In the stillness, he felt the pulse within his hands hum in harmony with everything he had known, and everything that was yet to be, a gentle rhythm that needed no name. They spoke of small joys, of losses that had left tenderness in their hearts, of days that had shaped them silently. Lyra reached out, touching the glow in his palm lightly, and he felt the warmth extend beyond himself, into the shared space between them. There was no urgency, no expectation, only the deep satisfaction of presence, of having witnessed and participated in a life woven from countless quiet acts. He realized that the echoes of past kindnesses, once small and hidden, now stretched far, touching more lives than he could ever count. As the hours unfolded, the bridge seemed suspended in a world apart, a place where time could pause without consequence. Lanterns bobbed along the river, some drifting together, some wandering alone, each carrying light into Duntus. Ilian and Lyra let the silence carry their thoughts, trusting that memory and love needed no explanation, only attention and care. He saw in every flickering light the reflection of his own journey, a testament to listening, to gentle action, to the quiet shaping of lives through steady presence. Eventually the night deepened, and stars emerged scattered across the sky like softly glowing lanterns themselves. Ilian felt the culmination of decades settle into him, the patience learned in gardens, the trust of friendship, the courage to give attention without demand, and the quiet joy of guiding another. He and Lyra rose together, walking slowly along the riverbank, each step a meditation, each breath a celebration of the ordinary, the meaningful, and the enduring. And as they disappeared into the soft embrace of darkness, the river carried the memory of their steps, their voices, and the silver pulse in his hands, into the world beyond sight, a song that would continue long after lanterns faded from view. Dawn broke softly over the valley, spilling pale light across the orchard and river, and the world seemed to exhale in quiet recognition of the passing night. Ilian stood on the bridge one last time, lantern in hand, feeling the rhythm of his own pulse echo against the gentle murmur of the water below. Years had shaped him into someone who understood the weight of stillness, the resonance of quiet care, and the subtle power of presence. He breathed in the crisp morning air, letting it fill him with gratitude for every small act, every whispered note, every hand held in silent understanding across the years. The garden stretched around him, alive in memory and reality alike. Every herb, every path, every wind-worn stone carried a fragment of the lessons he had learned: patience, kindness, attentive listening, and a deep, unspoken connections that shape a life. He thought of Lyra, of the clockmaker, of the child he had guided, and of countless moments too small to name, but too precious to forget. The silver glow in his hands shimmered faintly, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet affirmation of everything he had nurtured and received in return. He smiled, understanding that legacy is not in monuments or stories shouted aloud, but in the soft, steady echo of care passed forward. Ilian released the lantern onto the river, watching it drift downstream, mingling with all the others he had let go over the years. Each light carried a memory, a lesson, a quiet gift, shimmering like a constellation mirrored in water. He felt the pulse of life in every current, every breeze, every moment stretched between heartbeat and breath, And as he walked slowly back toward the garden, toward the familiar warmth of home and the gentle hum of clocks, he felt a profound peace, the kind that comes not from endings, but from understanding the continuity of presence, love, and gentle attention. The orchard sighed in the early light, and the river whispered across stones as if echoing a soft lullaby. Elian paused, lifting his hands to catch the first golden rays, letting them wash over him and settle within. Somewhere, Lyra's laughter joined the wind. Somewhere, the child he had guided traced the quiet pulse of discovery, and he understood, fully, that life's true treasures are not found in spectacle, but in the patient weaving of small, deliberate acts of care. He stretched his hands slowly, feeling them shimmer faintly one last time, and with that, he stretched into the stars. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.